Welcome. It's really my pleasure to speak about Thomas Starr King because, for one thing, I have immersed myself lately in the study of his life, and it's a wonderful immersion. I want to remember to say something. I really appreciated the selection that was just sung, Helpless by Neil Young. These days I'm reading Waging Heavy Peace. Waging Heavy Peace is Neil Young's autobiography. And I was struck by one passage in that book. Neil says about himself that for him, religion is walking through the woods. When I talk about Thomas Starr King, I'll talk a little bit about a book that he wrote about how walking through the woods or communing with nature nourished his soul and how he felt it was a vital part of religion. And how he was so inspired by one of his associates, Henry David Thoreau, and how he was inspired to write a book about how nature nourishes his soul. And Neil told a little anecdote that I just want to share. So he's walking in the woods one day, feeling the ecstasy of nature's evidence of something greater than himself that is worshipable and restorative. Beside him is his dog, friend. I don't remember the dog's name. But they're walking along through the woods, and Neil is in ecstasy, and then he notices that the dog isn't with him anymore. So he looks back, and sure enough, the dog is back there on the path, maybe 100 feet or more. And Neil is thinking, come on. And the dog refuses to come on. And Neil says, okay, I'm just going to go ahead. And he starts walking further, and the dog starts barking. And Neil reflects, this is a very quiet dog. This dog does not bark. And then it dawned on him, I'm trespassing. There's a danger ahead of me in the woods. And the dog is warning me. The dog may be actually saving my life. And he straight away turned around. And when he got to where the dog was wagging its tail and very happy, and they walked the other way. I thought it was a beautiful anecdote for the relationship between our religious sentiment and nature and the web of all existences of which we're part, one of our principles. And so I was really thrilled to hear that beautiful song. Thank you. Thomas Starr King. The first place I went to research this great Unitarian Universalist minister was the library, the main branch. There's little on Thomas Starr King in our main library. In fact, where you'll find information about this great, important American and Unitarian Universalist minister is in the histories of California. He lived in California for 4 years only. He was a New Englander. He sat in the library of Theodore Parker, who owned the largest library in New England, and New England was the wealthiest, and it was the seat of erudition in the United States. And Theodore Parker was one of the most eloquent and powerful Unitarian ministers ever. He knew Thoreau, he knew Emerson, and he lived most of his life, and most of his ministry was performed in New England. Why is it then that he's collected in the history of California? And that's where you'll find him in the public library. He was so instrumental in California's entry into the Union as a free state. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I listed some of the salient points of King's life. I'll read those, and then we'll embark on the adventure of talking a little bit about this person, about whom we could talk inexhaustively. He was born and named Thomas Starr King, but because there were so many Thomases, his parents chose to call him Starr. So his childhood, he was always called Starr. I thought that was interesting, if you have mentioned. He was a minister both in the Unitarian universe and in the Universalist. His father was a Universalist minister. and his first ministry was in a Universalist church. He was called to that ministry at age 21. But just a few years later, he was asked by Theodore Parker to stand in his place and perform the ministry of his church, a Unitarian church. So he was really conversant with both theologies, sensibilities, ideals, and ambitions, and he embraced both traditions to his heart. You know, it wasn't until the 60s that the two came together as one. But he was both a Unitarian and a Universalist. And he commented famously that Unitarians are convinced that human beings are too good to be damned to hell. And that Universalists believe that God is too good to damn human beings to hell. And knowing that he was immersed in both traditions and active in both traditions gives us a little more insight into how he could mount such a succinct description of one of the characteristics of this great faith tradition. Okay, another salient point. King was very, very erudite, but he didn't have a formal education. He was self-educated. Sitting in Theodore Parker's library, the most extensive library perhaps in America. Being coached by people like Hollis, who later became president, I think, of the Unitarian Association. And having contemporaries like Emerson and Thoreau. This lack of formal education really hampered his ascendancy to influence in New England. There was a lot of superciliousness in New England that if you didn't have a degree from Harvard, how dare you presume to give direction to society? However eloquent you may be, however cogent your arguments are, however right they are. King was a very small man. He was 5'2". He weighed about 120 pounds. He was not an imposing figure. And when people first met him, when they heard of his tremendous influence and impact on society, they thought, they're not talking about him, are they? I thought that was an interesting point. He said about himself, I weigh 120 pounds, but when I'm impassioned, I weigh a ton. He had a deeply resonant voice. It could boom. I think of Helen Barnes. I think of Marsha Biggs. I think of people who have been gifted with really fabulous, resonant, powerful voices. Evidently, that small frame housed one of those voices, and he could speak to an audience of 5,000 or more and be heard and move that audience. We'll hear more about that too. As I said before, he's a contemporary of Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. He was immensely admired by these men. Another salient point about King. He believed that a tempered appeal to reason and truth was better suited to result in the coveted goals of social reform that he held so strongly to his heart. For instance, abolition. He was a very, very strong abolitionist, but as you'll hear when I quote from his very words, he thought that too impassioned and invective against an institution that he considered thoroughly evil would have a counterproductive effect. He also had a strong love for America. His patriotism was a remarkable characteristic of Thomas Starr King. And that love of America was elicited in him because of America's high ideals of social justice, religious freedom, its progressive humanistic ideas. Another salient point. He was, I think, like my wife, and like the persons that I'm looking at here today, a person who really had extirpated racism from his heart. He was not racist at all. One of his best friends was an African-American, quote-unquote, in the parlance of the day, a free Negro. Randolph Ryer was a New York exporter. And most of what is collected historically about Thomas Starr King is from the letters, the correspondence that he kept up with his very dear friend, Randolph Ryer. 25 years of correspondence, and we'll hear from some of those letters. He was a strong advocate for the rights of workers, for the downtrodden, for overcoming poverty, and he had a very high regard for nature, as I said before. And one other thing that I think is remarkable and salient. This brilliant religious leader, this author, poet, orator, champion of human rights, died at a very early age. And I really think, although I didn't see it in any of the literature as I was poring over it, but he was a martyr to the ideals that he held because he worked himself to death. When he wasn't in the pulpit speaking to crowds of 2 or 3 or 5,000 people from his pulpit, days before electricity, okay, with this booming, resonant voice, this tiny man. He was in the fields, in the woods, in the factories, wherever people would gather, he was stumping for the ideals that were so important to him. Day and night. Traveling in those days was not easy, and so he traveled around to these outlying places and preach with great passion and vigor, and his health was never good. And there was a pitch, because the conflagration that we call the Civil War, he began his ministry just before that conflagration broke out. And as I said before, he was a strong abolitionist. So a lot of what I want to do today to introduce Thomas Starr King to you is read from his very words. By the way, you can go to the UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association's website and find much of this information. I think the first time I heard Thomas Starr King's name was when I began to attend Starr King School for the Ministry. It was in 1941 that the school was renamed Starr King after Thomas Starr King. It was previously the Pacific Unitarian School for the Ministry. He was a pastor, he was a preacher, he was a politician, he was a journalist, he was an orator, he was a patriot, he was a humanitarian, he was a naturalist, and he worked tirelessly for social justice. And a colleague wrote about him, he could and sometimes did speak scathing words against evil, but generally, he won his point and his hearers by the secret reason of his discourses and the rich, strange music of his voice, like an organ carrying conviction captive before its wonderful melody. And he himself said, we must give up the idea that the field of politics is beyond the reach and control of Christian responsibility, or we are lost. In other words, he felt that, and he was criticized soundly and roundly by certain circles for speaking on social issues of the day. And people were critical, saying, well, you're a minister. Why are you talking about politics? Politics and ministry don't go together. What are you doing? And he was making the point that the gospel, as he understood it, the message of religion, the essence of the religious project, is to affect human behavior in such a way that the quality of human life for all is uplifted and improved. And so he did not refuse to speak about the issues of the day with great passion. But as I said before, he was also careful to be temperate and respectful in his appeals. So he was age 21 in 1846 when he was ordained into the Universalist ministry. That was about 15 years before the start of the Civil War. He'd been greatly influenced by William Ellery Channing. It was Hosea Ballou who had tutored him in his training for the ministry, but that was informal. It wasn't at Harvard, as many of his contemporaries had good fortune to attend. Ralph Waldo Emerson said about him he was quite eloquent, and Theodore Parker invited him in 1845 to take his place as guest preacher when he had to be absent from his church. And Parker wrote, "This young man is not a regularly ordained preacher, but he has the grace of God in his heart and the gift of tongues. He is a rare, sweet spirit, and I know that after you've met with him, you will thank me for sending him to you." So his initial foray into the ministry was as a Universalist. He had the invitation to preach to a Unitarian congregation. His health was not good. He took a little sabbatical. And after that, he was called to the Unitarian Hollis Street Church in Boston. It's a very interesting story. The minister there was a very strong abolitionist, and he was also very strong on abstinence from alcohol. So he preached really fiery sermons in support of these two issues that were so close to his heart. And what was the result? He divided and decimated that church. It became peopled by fewer and fewer folk. It had less and less money and was on the brink of disaster. And at that time, a man in his mid-20s of very short stature and very slight weight was called into the ministry there. He was really criticized by people who were observant. First of all, he's a Universalist. Why are you asking him to be, the minister of a Unitarian church? He is ill-educated. It's a dangerous experiment. It is going to fail. He was there 11 years. In those 11 years, the congregation grew fivefold. He took the church out of bankruptcy, and he established it as the fastest growing church in that vicinity. So I mentioned that he believed in temperate speech, although he was impassioned and inflamed in his heart about the issues that he felt needed to be addressed. This is a quote from him. "I would insist as strongly as anyone on the right and duty of ministers to act as reformer, to speak in anti-slavery meetings and temperance and peace meetings if they have the power of popular address. Let them act as reformers in the proper sphere for such social action, and in the pulpit let them attack the central throne of sin in the private heart. If I can make loathe a sin and love right and goodness only, am I not leading that man to hate slavery and drunkenness, which are only special forms of sin?" So, I was recently reading a directive that was given to the boycotters in Selma, Alabama, when the bus boycott was declared by Dr. King. And there have been critics of what was said. It was said, for instance, if you see somebody being forcibly attacked or denounced, you shouldn't rush to their aid. You say, well, that doesn't sound like a very good instruction. Or that you should always be very pleasant and smiling and very polite and say thank you and yes, sir, and no, sir. People say, like, yeah, it sounds kind of like Uncle Thomism. What are you recommending there? Why did Dr. King take that form? And I put it in this perspective. You've heard of Black Wall Street near Tulsa, Oklahoma, a thriving metropolis put together by Black Americans. It had banks, it had fire departments, it had all of the fixtures of a great thriving metropolis, and it was reduced to ashes by the wrath of white people who bore hatred to blacks and who wanted to destroy any evidence that blacks had merit as human beings. Dr. King and his contemporaries were very sensitive to the fact that this is explosive stuff that we're talking about. Thomas Starr King had that same sensitivity. So we'll go a little further here. I hear frequently the charge that I preach politics and that it will make trouble if I do not desist. This undoubtedly refers to the frequency of the treatment I have given during the last year or so to the Christian spirit and obligation of humanity, and the application I have often made of it to our responsibility as members of the American government, as entrusted in part with the destiny of an empire. Wherever there is power, there is trust and duty. The preacher's business is with spiritual laws, and their bearing upon or their application with the duties and the actions of common life. And I'm skipping now. This was a sermon he gave. Let us understand each other on this point once and for all. You certainly have the right, as well as the power, to choose what type of preaching this pulpit shall represent. As long as I stay in it, it will represent no other than I have just described. Not because I ever intend or desire to preach politics, but because I feel I must preach devotion to humanity as the highest outward form of the gospel. Devotion to humanity as the highest outward form of devotion to the gospel. That's beautiful. And the obligation of doing the most good that possibly can be done by all of a man's influence. Evidence of his hatred of slavery. He's talking here about the secession of the South from the Union. So he calls it a rebellion. Rebellion sins against the Mississippi. It sins against the coastline. It sins against the public and beneficent peace. And it sins, worst of all, against the cornerstone of American progress and history and hope, the worth of the laborer, the rights of man. It strikes for barbarism against civilization. Henry's Freedom Box. It's a book I love. I'm saving it for my son when he's a little bit older. It's very, very beautifully illustrated. Marcia and I have talked about it being part of a presentation for our kids sometime soon here. Henry Box Brown was a slave. Henry Box Brown saw his wife and children sold off one day and couldn't do anything about it. It broke his heart. He mailed himself to freedom. He said, I got to get out of here. And his friends were saying, how are you going to do that? And he got the idea, put me in a box, seal the box, post it to a free state. 21 hours in a box, 3 feet by 2 feet. It said, don't turn it upside down. It was turned upside down and many other things. But Thomas Starr King wrote to his friend about this particular incident. Oh, here it is. Yay! This was to his friend Randolph Ryer. The most moving address I heard during the whole anniversary week was made by the black man who escaped from Richmond, Virginia in a box 3 feet long, 2 wide, and 2 deep. It was simply told, but had immense effect upon the whole audience. I thought while listening to it how much more powerful our anti-slavery societies would be if they could confine their efforts more to bringing such men in such cases before the community, and so try to make our northern conscience feel the barbarity of slavery than they are by the insane methods of denunciation, virulent attacks upon clergy and the church, and desperate hostility to the Constitution and the Union. Let them direct their efforts to exhibiting the curse of Negro bondage, and their ranks will soon be swelled by double the number of adherents which they possess at present. Why can't our reformers learn to have more confidence in truth and less in human passion? Again, he's ratifying that same idea that Dr. King espoused and implemented, which was in part so much responsible for the success of Dr. King's efforts. He said, always behave with love and compassion and respect, and never succumb to the lower nature in its pushings. He wrote later to his friend Randolph, yesterday morning I preached on consecration to God's will. In it, I made reference to the fugitive slave law as a hideous deification of all that is base and wrong, and an open defeat in the heart of Christian people of the mercy and Jesus by injustice and Satan. I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to skip a couple of the things I was going to read, but evidence of his devotion to the poor and the championing of those who were pushed down into poverty. He hated that, and he felt that it would destroy America if it wasn't addressed. And so labor rights and the rights of the working people and the indigent people has been a very strong pillar of Unitarian Universalist consciousness, and he was a champion of that. But I thought this quote was really, really so important. He spoke about community and right relationship. And before it was codified, our seventh principle of, respect for the interdependent web of life, he wrote these words: "We are not intended to be separate private persons, but rather fibers, fingers, and limbs. The aim of religion is not to perfect us as persons, looking at each of us apart from others. The Creator does not propose to polish souls like so many pins, each one dropping off clean and shiny, with no more organic relations to each other than pins of a card. There can be no such thing as justice until men, in large masses, are rightly related to each other." The seventh principle is very well articulated there. And in the context of the struggle for civil rights and human rights for Africans who were enslaved, and later when he was in San Francisco, for the Chinese, who made up such a large part of the community there, who were discriminated against and kept in poverty by race hatred. He was a champion of those as well. Now, I mentioned that he was only 4 years in California. In those 4 years, he did two very, very notable things. One is that he stumped all around the state and from his church, which also flourished under his ministry, against secession from the Union. "Anyway, we shall try to keep California with the North. This week I shall write my address on Washington for the 22nd, and I mean to manufacture a little thunder for our Southern brethren. They are beginning to talk Pacific Republic here, and we mean to squelch the idiots. And, oh, that the President would soon speak that electric sentence, inspiration to the loyal North, doom to the traitorous aristocracy whose cup is full of guilt. Let him say that if a war of mass against class, that it is a war of mass against class, of America against feudalism, of the schoolmaster against the slave master, of workmen against the barons, of the ballot box against the barracoon. That is what this struggle means. Proclaim it so, and what a light breaks through our leaden sky. The war wave rolls then with the impetus and the weight of an idea." And about racial justice and equality he wrote and delivered as a sermon. "We find, wherever we find many races brought together, here God has his greatest work to do. There is room for the noblest work of Christianity. The Almighty has a great mission for this nation. Here, the church is to proclaim the equality of the races. Wherever the oppressed are congregated, there Christ is present, and not on the side of power." This is from a sermon he gave called Lessons from the Sierra Nevada. And I put this under the rubric of his environmentalist sentiment. This is about the beauty of nature. I think of Neil finding God in the woods and in his dog's warning. Love of nature has its root in wonder and veneration, and it issues in many forms of practical good. There can be no abounding and ardent patriotism where sacred attachment to the scenery of our civil home is wanting. And there can be no abiding and inspiring religious joy in the heart that recognizes no presence and touch of God in the permanent surroundings of our earthly abode. The great bane of modern life is materialism. The divorce of spirit from power, order, bounty, and beauty in our thought of the world. We look upon nature as a machine, a play of forces that run of necessity and of course. We do not bow before it with wonder and awe as the manifestation of an present, all-animating will and art. Whatever leads us to such feelings toward the universe puts us on the road to Christian faith, helps character, and lifts the plane of the privilege of life. Now, mind you, he wrote a very well-received editorial or critique or criticism of Henry David Thoreau's On Walden Pond. I've read excerpts from that, and he really loved the book and praised it highly. His book, The White Hills, The Legends, Landscapes, and Poetry, was a much more popular book that championed the same values that Thoreau was talking about. In his day, it was a more popular book. It eclipsed the sales of Walden many, many times. Later, when he went to the Sierra Madre and he saw the mountains of California, he wrote to Randolph Ryer, his friend. He said, you know, if you can find a collection of those books written by that person, King, you should burn them or something, because I described the White Hills of New Hampshire as magnificent. Then I saw the mountains of California. It was a humorous letter to his friend. Another important thing that he did, I know I'm running over just a wee bit, and I almost wound up here. I want to give justice to this great Unitarian Universalist minister. Another contribution that he made was to the proto-Red Cross. The Red Cross really came about through the activities of Clara Barton, who was also in our faith tradition. She was the nurse who really did so much. But before the Red Cross came about, the Sanitary Commission was formed. Why? Well, nobody had understood the cost in human life and carnage that the Civil War would produce. And there was absolutely no resource for taking care of wounded soldiers. And Starr King was one of the first persons to champion the Sanitary Commission. And when it was near bankruptcy, he articulated a strategy and plan that restored not just what was needed to cover the debt that it had gone into, but it became flush with money, redolent with money, because of Thomas Starr King's preaching to support it. So I want to leave with a benediction that Thomas Starr King presented in one of his sermons. I think it's great. I think it could be made into a benediction, so I will attempt to do that here. I may read it twice, once as he wrote it, and then another as a kind of blessing or benediction. Make a principle a guest in your heart. Make a principle a guest in your heart. But by denying the worldly side of your nature, by fettering passion, conquering pride, living for something other than luxury, using money for good, drilling the will to loyalty. And it will become thus an immeasurable gain as a resource to your soul. God bends a boundless and sparkling sky over our heads. But he offers a deeper heaven, filled with more glorious light and diviner promise to all souls that will welcome a principle. Go out and pitch their tent in the moral universe and live here for him. So, as a benediction, make a principle a guest in your heart. Like freedom or justice, equality, the progressive religious values of this tradition. Make those principles guests in your heart. Deny the worldly side of your nature. And there he kind of qualifies what he means there. Fetter passion, conquer pride, live for something other than material ease. As I mentioned before, he sacrificed his life. He was a married man. He had a child, at least one child I read about, a daughter, who survived him, and a wife. So he had a lot of good in this world, but he felt that his mission was so important that he worked tirelessly. He worked himself into his grave at an early age. So he lived by what he said, living for something other than luxury, used money for good, drilled the will to loyalty, loyalty to your principles, loyalty to your vision and your ideals. And thus it will be an immeasurable gain as a resource to your soul. So I'll try that once more. May your soul be enriched, made abundantly wealthy by the hosting of the principles of progressive religion in your hearts. May you go forth with all success as Thomas Starr King did. And may you live forever as Thomas Starr King does indeed. Live forever in the memory of Californians, in the memory of Unitarian Universalists, in the memory of everyone who patiently and carefully studies the history of America as one of the greatest champions of human rights, human dignity, and freedom that this nation or this world has ever seen. Thank you very much.